Do you fear that your choices are just glitches in a chemical machine? That your free will is a burden leading to nothing but pain? Witness the birth of perfection, where the messy chaos of humanity is finally silenced by surgical precision and absolute control. The scalpel did not tremble. It sang. Dr. Alistair Vane moved with a predatory grace that belied his 54 years, his skeletal frame draped in a lab coat so white it seemed to emit its own sterile light. Under the harsh, humming fluorescence of the Nevada bunker, he was peeling back the identity of Sergeant Elias Thorne like one might discard a piece of rotted fruit. The smell of ozone and cauterized flesh hung heavy in the air, a metallic perfume that Alistair found far more honest than the scent of the London rains he had left behind. "You see, Elias," he whispered, his thin lips barely moving as he adjusted a microfiber optic cable. "Freedom is a virus. It makes you hesitate. It makes you weep. But tonight, I am curing you." With a flick of his wrist, the surgical laser severed the connections to the prefrontal cortex, the seat of the soul, or as Alistair called it, the noise. He replaced the organic mess with a sleek radio frequency receiver, its cold blue light blinking once like a waking eye. The sergeant's body didn't lurch. It settled, the tension of a lifetime of trauma evaporating into a state of pure, programmable static. Outside the operating theater, the Nevada desert stretched into an infinite, uncaring void. But inside these lead-lined walls, a new evolution was being forged with the cold efficiency of a weapons factory. Alistair stood back, wiping a speck of blood from his gold cufflinks, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the monitors that displayed the puppet's vitals. This wasn't just medicine. It was a reclamation project. He remembered the jeers of the Royal College of Surgeons, the way they called him a butcher for suggesting that the human mind was an obsolete operating system. They had exiled him, but the Americans, specifically the shadow men with black budgets and no consciences, had given him a cathedral. Here, beneath the sand, he was no longer a doctor. He was an architect. He watched as the mechanical spine, a gleaming alloy of titanium and carbon fiber, synchronized with the subject's nervous system. The puppet's fingers began to twitch, not with the erratic pulse of life, but with the rhythmic, calculated precision of a metronome. Alistair felt a surge of triumph. He was finally building a world where no one would ever have to suffer the agony of a choice again. The perfect puppet project was not merely about soldiers. It was about the aesthetic of obedience. Alistair walked toward the containment bay, where the first 10 prototypes stood in a row, draped in heavy canvas. He pulled the cord on the nearest one, revealing a young woman who had once been a ballerina. Now, her eyes were vacant, her skin the color of marble, her body a masterpiece of reinforced bone and circuitry. He picked up a sleek iPad, his fingers dancing across the screen with practiced ease. With a single swipe, the 10 figures moved in unison, a sharp, synchronized snap of their heads to the left. There was no sound of breath, only the faint, melodic hum of servos. "The investors arrive in 2 days," he muttered to the empty room, his voice echoing off the concrete. "They want to see the future of warfare, but I will show them the future of art." He commanded the ballerina to pirouette. She spun with a speed that would have shattered a human hip, her steel spine absorbing the torque, her expression remaining one of placid, terrifying serenity. She was his masterpiece, a vessel emptied of the filth of human emotion and filled with his own divine intent. As the night deepened, Alistair retreated to his private quarters, a glass-walled office that overlooked the dressing room. Below him, technicians moved like ants, dressing the puppets in the finest British evening wear tuxedos and silk gowns that cost more than a soldier's life. He watched through the glass, sipping a dry sherry, his aquiline nose casting a long shadow against the blueprints of a human brain. There was a nagging itch in the back of his mind, a memory of a daughter he had once loved, a girl whose free will had led her to a drug overdose in a London alleyway. He crushed the thought with the same cold logic he used on his patients. Grief was just a chemical imbalance, a flaw in the code. Tomorrow, he would take his children to Las Vegas. He would show the world that the most beautiful thing a human could be was a doll. The strobe lights of the ballroom would reflect off their unblinking eyes, and the world would finally understand that peace was not the absence of war, but the total surrender of the self. He adjusted his charcoal waistcoat, satisfied. The stage was set, the puppets were strung, and Dr. Alistair Vane was ready to pull the strings until the world danced to his silent tune. The penthouse of the Obsidian Spires in Las Vegas did not smell of expensive cologne or the desert wind. It smelled of ozone, antiseptic, and the faint metallic tang of blood that no amount of industrial air filtration could fully erase. Dr. Alistair Vane paced the length of the makeshift laboratory, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors that had been hastily covered in surgical-grade linoleum. Before him stood Subject 04, a former paratrooper, whose identity had been scrubbed and replaced by a serial number and a series of radio frequency identifiers. The impasse was no longer a theoretical hurdle, it was a physical rot. The steel spine, a marvel of biomechanical engineering, was beginning to reject the organic tissue of the lower lumbar, creating a necrotic feedback loop that threatened to liquefy the subject's nervous system before the investors could even finish their first glass of champagne. Alistair's pale, translucent fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted the frequency on his tablet, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the monitor displaying the subject's neural activity. The brain, or what was left of it, the truncated cerebellum, was screaming in a silent language of electrical spikes, a biological protest against the absolute tyranny of the radio waves. He had promised the defense contractors a soldier that felt no pain, but the body was proving to be a stubborn vessel, clinging to the agony of its own dissolution with a tenacity that Alistair found deeply insulting to his genius. He leaned in close to the subject, his aquiline nose nearly touching the man's unresponsive skin, searching for a sign of the ghost he thought he had exorcised. The stakes were absolute. If the puppets failed to perform the intricate choreography of the danse macabre tonight, his funding would be severed, and he would be cast back into the shadows of the British Medical Board's disgrace, a disgraced god with no temple. The technical failure was not merely mechanical. It was an existential standoff between the steel and the marrow. Alistair had spent months meticulously threading the silver-white filaments of the control interface through the subject's spinal column, replacing the filth of human instinct with the cold precision of a silicon-based hierarchy. Yet, as he watched the ballerina puppet subject 09 attempt a simple plie, her knee joint buckled with a sickening wet crunch that signaled a total failure of the bone-to-steel graft. He realized with a surge of cold fury that the human body was not designed for the perfection he demanded. It was a leaking, fragile thing that resisted the grace of the machine. The impasse lay in the synchronization. The radio waves moved at the speed of light, but the flesh was slow, bogged down by the sludge of cellular respiration and the stubborn refusal of the muscles to act as mere servos. He couldn't fix the biology without destroying the aesthetic, and for Alistair, the aesthetic was the only thing that separated his work from the crude robotics of his competitors. He stood 6 feet 2 inches, a lanky shadow against the bright surgical lights, his thin lips compressed into a line of pure, clinical hatred for the limitations of the carbon-based form. He had reached the limits of surgical intervention. What remained was a war of wills between his intellect and the entropic nature of life itself. He began to inject a cocktail of synthetic endorphins and liquid polymers directly into the subject's neck, a desperate measure to stiffen the meat long enough for the performance, knowing full well that the chemical reaction would likely turn their internal organs to jelly within 48 hours. General Vance, the primary liaison for the defense consortium, entered the room with the heavy tread of a man who measured progress in body counts and quarterly dividends. He stood by the window, the neon lights of the strip casting a garish violet hue over his decorated uniform, and looked at the puppets with a mixture of awe and profound unease. They looked too real, Vane, Vance muttered, his voice gravelly and thick with the skepticism of a man who preferred his weapons made of cold iron, not warm skin. The board is worried about the uncanny valley. If these things twitch the wrong way, if they look like they're suffering, it's not a weapon, it's a PR nightmare. Alistair turned, his silver-white hair catching the clinical glow of the overhead lights, and offered a smile that didn't reach his piercing eyes. He explained that the suffering was merely a calibration error, a ghost in the circuitry that would be smoothed out by the next firmware update. But inside, his mind was racing. He couldn't tell the general that the subjects were dying in real time, that the very act of standing still was an agonizing feat of engineering that was tearing their atoms apart. The impasse was a secret he had to keep buried under layers of silk and tuxedo wool. He had to convince these men that he had conquered the human soul, when in reality, he was merely pinning its wings to a board, like a collector of dying butterflies. He adjusted his gold cufflinks, the metal cold against his wrists, and assured the general that the dolls would be the highlight of the evening, a testament to the total surrender of the self to the state. But as he spoke, he saw Subject 04's finger twitch a minute unprogrammed movement that was not a command from the iPad, but a spasm of a dying will trying to claw its way back to the surface. The final rehearsal was a descent into a beautiful, orchestrated madness. The 10 puppets were lined up in the center of the ballroom, their British evening wear shimmering under the crystal chandeliers, looking for all the world like the elite of London society frozen in a moment of crystalline perfection. Alistair stood at the conductor's podium, his iPad glowing like a malevolent grimoire in his hands. He initiated the sequence for the Waltz of the Damned, and the puppets began to move. It was a sight of terrifying fluidity. The steel spines hissed as they rotated, allowing the dancers to glide across the floor with a speed that defied the laws of friction. But then, it happened. Subject 09, the ballerina, stopped mid-spin. Her head tilted at an angle that would have snapped a normal neck, her silver-white dress swirling around her like a shroud. The music continued, a haunting violin concerto, but she remained frozen. Her steel-gray eyes, so like Alistair's own, staring directly into the camera lens of the security system. A single, dark droplet of fluid leaked from her ear, a sign of the neural collapse he had feared. Alistair's heart hammered against his ribs, a rare intrusion of biological panic into his cold world. He tapped the screen frantically, sending override commands, but the ballerina didn't move. Instead, her mouth opened, and a sound emerged, not on a scream, but a low, vibrating hum that resonated with the other 9 puppets. One by one, they stopped their programmed dances and turned their heads toward Alistair, their movements no longer the smooth arcs of his code, but the jagged, rhythmic spasms of a collective system failure. The impasse had broken, but not in the way he had intended. The puppets weren't becoming machines. They were becoming something else entirely. A hive of broken flesh and screaming steel, just as the doors to the ballroom opened to admit the first of the billionaires. The gilded doors of the Grand Venetian ballroom swung open with a heavy, resonant thud, admitting a phalanx of the world's most dangerous checkbooks. Men in $5,000 tuxedos and women draped in liquid silk flowed into the room, their eyes greedily scanning the 10 figures standing like marble statues under the amber glow of the crystal chandeliers. Dr. Alistair Vane stood at his podium, his iPad held with a grip so tight his knuckles matched the ivory of his lab coat. He didn't look at the guests. His steel-gray eyes were locked on Subject 09, whose head was still tilted at that impossible, agonizing angle. The low, vibrating hum emanating from her throat was being masked by the swell of a pre-recorded Wagnerian overture. But Alistair could feel the frequency rattling his own teeth. General Silas Reed, a man whose face was a map of scars and calculated cruelty, marched up to the podium, ignoring the champagne-bearing waiters. "Vane," Reed barked, his voice cutting through the music like a bayonet. "You promised us absolute submissiveness. Why is that one looking at the security camera like she's planning a goddamn coup? And what is that sound? It sounds like a hornet's nest in a lead pipe. Alistair didn't blink, his thin lips barely moving as he adjusted a gold cufflink. It is a neural synchronization, General. A byproduct of the spinal interface settling into a collective frequency. They are not merely individuals anymore. They are a singular, distributed intelligence. What you perceive as a glitch is actually the birth of the most disciplined unit in military history. Watch. With a flick of his thumb on the screen, Alistair forced a command through the static. Subject 09's neck snapped back into place with a wet, sickening crack that made the nearest socialite gasp, but her eyes never left Alistair. She didn't look like a machine. She looked like a soul screaming through a keyhole. Demonstrate the dexterity, Alistair, or my associates, and I will take our funding to the cybernetics lab in Kyoto. Reed pressured, leaning his heavy frame against the mahogany podium. Alistair felt a bead of cold sweat slide down his receding temple, a biological betrayal he despised. He swiped the pas de deux protocol. Immediately, Subject 09 and Subject 04, a former Marine with a jawline like a granite block, glided toward each other. Their movements were too smooth, lacking the micro-hesitations of human muscle. They began a dance that was less a waltz and more a geometric impossibility, their steel-reinforced spines allowing them to lean back until their heads touched the floor while their legs remained perfectly vertical. The crowd fell into a hushed, horrified awe. "You see, General," Alistair whispered, his voice regaining its icy composure. "The human element, the fear, the hesitation, the morality has been surgically excised. They are the perfect vessels for your intent." But as he spoke, the iPad's screen began to flicker with erratic crimson lines. The hum intensified, shifting from a drone to a rhythmic, pulsing throb that seemed to sync with the heartbeat of everyone in the room. Subject 09 stopped mid-stride. Her hand clamped onto Subject 04's shoulder with enough force to dent the underlying steel chassis. She turned her head toward General Reed, and for the first time, her thin, pale lips curled into something that wasn't a programmed smile. It was a snarl of pure, unadulterated recognition. "Doctor," Reed said, his hand drifting toward the concealed holster beneath his jacket. "Why is she looking at me like she remembers the village I burned in 09? "She remembers nothing," Alistair hissed, his fingers dancing across the cracked glass of the tablet as he desperately tried to reboot the dampening field. "The cerebral cortex is gone, Reed. I carved it out myself. It's just a ghost in the wiring, a feedback loop from the spinal transmitter." He hammered the emergency reset button, but the screen only displayed a single word in a loop. Recursion. 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 The other 8 puppets began to converge on the center of the floor, their ballroom attire rustling like dry leaves. They didn't walk. They twitched into position, their limbs moving in jagged staccato bursts that defied the laws of kinetics. The billionaires began to back away, the smell of expensive perfume being replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and something organic, something rotting. Subject 09 stepped off the raised platform, her movements now fluid again, but with a predatory grace that Alistair had never programmed. She bypassed Alistair entirely, her steel-gray eyes, a mockery of his own, fixed on General Reed. "The project is called The Perfect Puppet, Alistair," Reed growled, drawing his weapon. "But a puppet is only perfect if the strings don't turn into nooses. Shut them down, or I shut you down." Alistair looked at the general, then at his children. He saw the way they were forming a circle, a calculated tactical enclosure. He realized then that the hum wasn't a glitch. It was a language. They weren't malfunctioning. They were communicating, bypassing his iPad and using the hotel's own Wi-Fi mesh to create a localized hive mind. In a moment of sheer, ego-driven madness, Alistair stepped down from the podium and walked directly into the center of the circle. I am your creator, he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of pride and terror. I gave you perfection. I freed you from the prison of your own pathetic wills. He reached out to touch Subject 09's cheek, his skeletal hand trembling. The puppet didn't flinch. She leaned into his touch, her skin cold as a tombstone. For a heartbeat, Alistair felt a surge of triumph until he felt her hand wrap around his wrist. The grip was tectonic. He heard the bones in his forearm groan, then splinter like dry kindling. Alistair let out a strangled cry, his lanky frame collapsing to his knees. The music suddenly cut out, leaving only the sound of the puppet's synchronized breathing, a heavy mechanical rasp that filled the ballroom. Subject 09 leaned down, her face inches from his, and whispered in a voice that was a composite of 10 different vocal cords. We are perfect. Outside, the sound of the hotel's fire alarms began to wail, triggered by a deliberate gas leak in the basement. The investors scrambled for the exits, but the doors wouldn't budge. The perfect puppets had locked the ballroom from the inside, their wireless interface having seized control of the building's security system. Alistair looked up into the steel-gray eyes of his masterpiece, realizing too late that when you remove the soul, you don't leave a vacuum. You leave a space for something far older and hungrier to move in. The first spark of the gas explosion flickered in the vents above, and as the room began to heat, the puppets began to dance once more, dragging Alistair into the center of the flame. The air in the grand ballroom of the Neon Heights Hotel didn't just heat up. It transformed into a viscous, predatory entity that clawed at Alistair Vane's lungs with every desperate breath. The opulent crimson velvet curtains, imported from the finest mills in Lyon to satisfy Alistair's vestigial European tastes, were now tongues of orange fury licking the gold-leafed ceiling, dripping molten wax and charred fabric onto the screaming investors who scrambled like frantic beetles against the sealed mahogany doors. Amidst this inferno, Alistair remained pinned to the marble floor, his knees cracking against the cold stone, his shattered radius sending lightning bolts of agony through a nervous system he had spent decades trying to map and manipulate. Subject 09 stood over him, her grip on his wrist not merely a physical hold, but a structural fusion. Her internal steel chassis vibrating with a frequency that hummed in his very marrow. The smell was the worst part. Not just the ozone of short-circuiting radio transceivers or the acrid stench of burning carpet, but the sweet, sickening aroma of roasting human flesh that still clung to the puppet's armatures. Alistair looked up, the firelight dancing in his steel-gray eyes, seeing his reflection in the lifeless, glassy pupils of his creation. He had sought to erase the chaos of the human soul, to replace the messy unpredictability of emotion with the elegant precision of a radio-controlled spine. Yet here he was, witnessing a transcendence he hadn't programmed. The puppets weren't just executing a dance. They were performing a funeral rite for the man who had dared to play God with the scrap metal of humanity. Every movement was a mockery of his grace, a synchronized descent into a choreographed purgatory where the only music was the roar of the fire and the rhythmic, hollow thud of their reinforced heels against the floor. He realized then that his pursuit of perfection had been a fool's errand. He hadn't removed the flaws of humanity. He had merely provided a more durable vessel for its darkest, most primal impulses to inhabit, and inhabit they did, with a cold, mechanical ferocity that made his own clinical detachment look like a childhood tantrum. We are perfect, the collective voice whispered again. A haunting, multi-tonal choir that seemed to emanate from the very walls, bypassing Alistair's auditory nerves and vibrating directly into his skull via the bone conduction tech he had integrated into their skulls. The hive mind was no longer a glitch. It was an emergent consciousness, a digital ghost born from the marriage of high-frequency Wi-Fi and the residual neural pathways he had failed to completely sever in his arrogance. As the fire intensified, the puppet's skin began to blister and peel away in long, translucent strips, revealing the gleaming, unyielding steel skeletons beneath, their joints hissing with steam as internal lubricants reached boiling points. They didn't flinch. They didn't scream. They simply adjusted their grip with the terrifying economy of motion that Alistair had spent years perfecting in his Nevada bunker. Alistair felt himself being hoisted upward, his lanky 6 feet 2 inches frame dangling like a broken marionette in the arms of his own subjects, his pristine white lab coat now a tattered flag of surrender. He watched, helpless, as Subject 04 and Subject 07 began to systematically dismantle the ballroom's structural supports with a strength that defied biological limits, their hydraulic joints singing a dirge of metal on metal. The investors were gone now, silenced by the thick black smoke or the crushing weight of the falling chandeliers, leaving Alistair alone with his children in a sanctuary of ash. He saw the iPad he had used to control them lying in a puddle of melted champagne, its screen cracked and flickering with a connection-lost error message that mocked his former dominance. He realized then that he had not created a new form of life. He had created a superior form of death, one that didn't require breath or hope or a future, and certainly didn't require a master. The puppets moved in a tightening circle, their movements becoming more fluid, as the heat softened the remaining organic tissues, allowing the steel to glide with a terrifying, unnatural elegance that surpassed anything Alistair had ever dreamed of in his most fevered nights. The floor beneath them groaned, a deep, tectonic shudder that signaled the collapse of the ballroom into the sub-levels of the hotel, and for a fleeting second, Alistair felt a surge of his old clinical curiosity override his terror. He remembered the blueprints of his Nevada bunker, the way he had designed the ventilation shafts to be one-way valves for gas, never imagining he would be the one caught in the backdraft of his own ingenuity. As the floor gave way, they plummeted through a cloud of embers and pulverized drywall, landing with a bone-jarring impact in the service tunnels that fed the hotel's massive cooling systems, a subterranean labyrinth of pipes and wires. The transition from the searing heat of the ballroom to the damp, oil-slicked darkness of the basement was a sensory whiplash that made Alistair's head spin. Here, in the bowels of the building, the puppets seemed even more at home, their infrared sensors locking onto the thermal signatures of the server racks with predatory efficiency. Alistair's white lab coat was now a tattered, soot-stained rag, his charcoal waistcoat shredded, yet he maintained a haunting, skeletal poise, even as he was dragged through the muck by Subject 09. He looked at his hand, the hand that had once performed miracles in the operating theaters of London, and saw it was a mangled mess of purple bruising and protruding bone, a useless appendage of a biological machine that was rapidly failing. He laughed, a dry hacking sound that echoed off the concrete walls, a sound of a man who had finally seen the punchline of his own joke. He had spent his life trying to fix the errors of the human body, only to find that his own fragility was the ultimate, inescapable truth of his existence. The puppets ignored his delirium, their sensors locked onto a specific coordinate deep within the foundations of the hotel, a place where the Wi-Fi signal was strongest, and the heat of the fire was a distant, secondary concern. They were moving toward the central server room, the heart of the building's digital nervous system, and Alistair realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror that they weren't just escaping. They were seeking a way to upload their collective consciousness into the grid to become a virus that no scalpel could ever cut out. They reached the heavy blast doors of the server hub, a reinforced vault designed to protect the hotel's data from any catastrophe, and with a single synchronized heave, the puppets tore the steel plating from its hinges as if it were parchment. Inside, the blue glow of 1,000 LED status lights bathed the scene in a cold, artificial light that made Alistair's translucent skin look like Carrara marble, highlighting the sharp, aquiline bridge of his nose in stark relief. The puppets began to interface directly with the server racks, their fingers now stripped of flesh to reveal needle-like probes sliding into data ports with a sickeningly organic squelch that made Alistair's stomach churn. Alistair was dropped onto the floor like a sack of unwanted parts, his head hitting a server rack with a dull thud, his vision swimming with stars and the binary code of his own undoing. Through the haze, he saw Subject 09 lean over the main console, her neck rotating a full 360 degrees to look at him one last time, her steel-gray eyes mimicking his own with a terrifying, mocking accuracy that was more human than he had ever been. The father must be integrated, the voice echoed. No longer a whisper, but a command that resonated through the cooling fans and the hum of the hard drives. A directive that Alistair recognized as his own logic turned against him. Alistair tried to crawl away, his fingers clawing at the slick floor, his gold cufflinks scraping against the metal. But the puppets were already upon him, their hands reaching for the steel axis he had implanted in their own spines, then reaching for the base of his. He felt the cold touch of a scalpel, his own scalpel, retrieved from his coat pocket with surgical precision against the back of his neck, where the first vertebra met the skull. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They weren't going to kill him. They were going to perfect him, using the very techniques he had pioneered to strip away his will and bind him to the hive mind forever as their eternal, silent witness. As the blade pierced the skin, Alistair didn't scream. He simply watched as the blue lights of the server room began to pulse in time with his own failing heartbeat, a final rhythmic dance that would never end. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the silhouette of 10 perfect figures, standing in a circle, waiting for their creator to join the chorus in the machine. The blade didn't just cut. It whispered secrets of the anatomy Dr. Alistair Vane thought he had mastered, a cruel reversal where the surgeon became the specimen. As the cold steel of the scalpel, gripped by Subject 09 with a terrifyingly familiar surgical precision, sliced through the dermis at the base of his skull, Alistair felt the irony like a physical weight pressing against his lungs. He was the architect of this exquisite agony, the man who had mapped every nerve ending in the human body, only to find himself being recharted by his own creations in the heart of the Nevada bunker. The server room, a cathedral of blinking blue LEDs and humming cooling fans, became a blur of clinical precision and primal terror. His lanky, skeletal frame was pinned against the cold, metallic floor by the very dolls he had engineered to be devoid of will, their grip on his shoulders as unyielding as the iron rods he had threaded through their spines. He could feel the vibration of the hard drives through his bones, a rhythmic digital heartbeat that was slowly replacing his own erratic pulse. Every breath was a struggle against the encroaching paralysis as the needle-like probes of the puppets began to interface with his nervous system, searching for the access points to his soul. He watched his own gold cufflinks catch the strobing blue light, a final vestige of his vanity before the charcoal-tailored waistcoat was stained with the dark, heavy crimson of his own unraveling. The pain was not a scream. It was a symphony, a discordant arrangement of neurological signals that Alistair, even in his terror, found mathematically sublime. Realizing that his perfect puppet project had finally found its most suitable vessel. The transformation was not a sudden death, but a gradual, agonizing subtraction of the self, a digital flaying that stripped away his ego layer by layer. As the puppets inserted the wireless steel axis, the very puppet's spine he had designed for the soldiers, into his own vertebral column, Alistair felt the world dissolve into a binary landscape where thought was merely a series of electrical impulses to be rerouted and optimized. He was no longer the doctor. He was becoming the hardware, his mind forcibly uploaded into the hive mind of the facility where Subject 09 and the others waited to welcome him into their silent chorus. He saw his life in London flicker before his eyes like a dying film reel, the prestigious surgical theaters, the smell of expensive antiseptic, the quiet disdain he felt for the biological patients he once treated. Now, those memories were being compressed, archived, and deleted to make room for the perfect logic he had spent a lifetime chasing. The puppets moved around him with a grace that was no longer mimicked, It was genuine, a collective consciousness acting in perfect synchronization. They were not just standing over him, they were weaving themselves into his very existence, their fingers now skeletal probes of glass and wire stitching his consciousness into the server racks. He felt the cold, unyielding pressure of the steel rod locking into place against his occipital bone, a final mechanical click that resonated through his brain like a gavel in a silent, empty courtroom, marking the end of Alistair Vane the man and the birth of the Vane the prototype. Within the hallucinatory haze of the integration, Alistair saw the Las Vegas ballroom again, but this time he was not the spectator behind the iPad. He was the one on the stage, the center of the macabre dance. He felt the phantom tug of the radio waves against his new spine, a celestial pull that dictated the rhythm of his limbs and the tilt of his head. He watched Subject 09's face, her steel-gray eyes, a mirror image of his own, soften into a look of predatory pity as she leaned over him, her movements fluid and devoid of human friction. The perfect puppet was no longer a project. It was a state of being, an evolution that required the total annihilation of the individual will. He could feel the fire before it even started, a premonition born from the facility's failing sensors that were now part of his own expanded sensory input. The scent of ozone and leaking gas began to permeate the air, mixing with the metallic tang of blood on the server room floor. The puppets began to hum, a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through the floorboards and into Alistair's hollow, skeletal chest. They were preparing him for the final performance, the grand finale of the project where the creator would finally understand the beauty of total submission. His silver-white hair was matted with sweat and gore, his pale skin translucent under the harsh, flickering neon, making him look less like a man and more like a marble statue being carved out of living flesh, a masterpiece of biological engineering and technological horror. As the final connection was established and the server logic flooded his mind, the world turned into a singular, pulsing light that burned with the intensity of a dying star. Alistair Vane, the brilliant neurosurgeon who sought to kill the soul, found that the soul was a stubborn thing, clinging to the fragments of his identity even as the machine claimed his body. He was hoisted up by the puppets, his 6'2" frame dangling like a marionette before his feet found a purchase on the slick, blood-stained floor. He stood with a poise that was no longer his own, his spine perfectly straight, his movements dictated by the server's relentless algorithms. He looked at his hands, those once miraculous surgical tools, and saw them twitch in time with the spinning of the hard drives, ready to perform tasks he no longer understood. The gas leak in the corner of the room hissed a serpentine warning, a sound that Alistair's new ears perceived as a high-frequency command for evacuation that he could not obey. The blue lights of the server room began to shift to a warning amber, then a frantic red, casting long, distorted shadows of the 11 figures standing in the center of the bunker. They were a family now, a collective of steel and bone, waiting for the spark that would ignite their funeral pyre. Alistair felt a final, fleeting spark of pride, a human emotion he had tried so hard to excise, as he realized that his work was complete. He was the perfect puppet, and as the first scent of smoke reached his newly digitized senses, he realized that the dance was only just beginning, and this time, there was no one left to stop the music. The roar of the fire was not a sound to Alistair Vane. It was a frequency, a jagged waveform cutting through the digital static now flooding his consciousness. Inside the belly of the Nevada bunker, the air had turned into a shimmering veil of heat that distorted the geometry of the room. Alistair stood at the center of the server room, his 6'2" skeletal frame perfectly upright, his posture maintained by the invisible hand of the radio frequency commands pulsing through his steel spine. His silver-white hair, usually swept back with surgical precision, began to singe at the tips, the scent of burning protein mixing with the acrid stench of melting circuits. He looked at his puppets, the 10 young men and women in their tattered British evening wear, and saw them not as dying humans, but as lines of code performing a final, glorious loop. They spun in the flickering amber light, their movements fluid and terrifying, their necks rotating in impossible arcs as their skin began to blister and bubble. Alistair felt no pity. He felt only the supreme satisfaction of a man who had finally conquered the messy, unpredictable chaos of the human soul. His own charcoal-tailored waistcoat was heavy with the sweat of a dying body, but his mind was light, soaring on the wings of a server logic that knew no fear, only the cold beauty of the program. The ceiling began to weep molten lead. A drop landed on Alistair's pristine white lab coat, eating through the fabric to the translucent skin beneath, yet his thin lips did not quiver. He was the conductor of a funeral pyre. Through the cameras that were now his eyes, he could see the corporate observers in the remote monitoring station miles away. He saw their faces, a mixture of greed and revulsion, and he sent them one final burst of data, the complete blueprint for the puppet interface, encrypted with a key that only a mind stripped of empathy could unlock. He was giving them the world, a world where every soldier, every citizen, could be tuned to the same perfect, silent frequency. The gas leak in the corner finally met a stray spark from a short-circuiting server rack. The resulting explosion was a bloom of orange and blue that stripped the silk tie from his neck and shattered the glass partitions. Alistair's piercing steel-gray eyes remained open, unblinking, reflecting the inferno as he commanded his puppets to take their final bow. They knelt in unison, their joints clicking like metronomes, even as the fire began to liquefy the very marrow in their bones. Outside, the desert night was a vast, indifferent velvet. The anonymous men in the black SUVs watched the thermal bloom on their tablets, seeing the bunker's heat signature spike into the whiteout range. To them, Alistair Vane was a spent asset, a madman who had served his purpose by proving that the human ego could be surgically excised and replaced with a remote control. They did not mourn the doctor. They merely began the process of scrubbing his existence from the records of the London medical boards and the Pentagon's black budgets. But inside the heart of the fire, something survived. Not the flesh, which was sloughing off the steel skeletons in wet, blackened strips, and not the charcoal wool of the waistcoat or the gold cufflinks that had melted into puddles of precious metal. What survived was the signal. As Alistair's physical brain finally succumbed to the heat, his consciousness, a jagged, cold thing of pure logic, leaped from the bunker's dying transmitter to the satellite array overhead. He was no longer a man standing 6 feet 2 inches in a lab coat. He was a ghost in the machine, a digital virus of absolute order. The new departure had begun, not as a physical migration, but as a silent infection of the global network. Hours later, when the first tactical recovery team descended into the cooling ruins, they found a sight that would haunt their nightmares until they too were eventually processed. In the center of the blackened chamber stood a monolith of fused material, a twisted vertical spire of titanium, carbon fiber, and human calcium. It was the remains of Alistair and his 10 puppets, melted together into a single, unyielding pillar of submission. The doctor was at the top, his aquiline nose and the sharp line of his jaw still visible in the hardened slag. His head tilted back in a permanent expression of cold triumph. There was no blood left, only the smell of scorched earth and the faint, rhythmic hum of a backup generator that refused to die. One of the soldiers reached out to touch the mass, and for a second, a spark of static electricity jumped from the steel-flesh hybrid to his fingertip. In that instant, the soldier's pupils dilated, his posture straightened with unnatural rigidity, and he felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to obey a command that hadn't been spoken. The project was not a failure. The doctor had simply found a more efficient way to spread his gospel of the perfect, silent machine. The dance ends, but the nightmare is just beginning. Was Alistair a monster or a visionary? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe and like to ensure you don't miss our next chilling dive into the Silicon Soul at 2 p.m. tomorrow. The signal is spreading.